Rain poured down like a waterfall against the rusted tin roof of Donovan's diner, beating out a rhythm so steady it nearly drowned the wheezing of the old coffee machine behind the counter. My fingers ached as I scrubbed again and again at a faded stain on the laminate tabletop, the sharp scent of industrial cleaner mixing with years of grease until the air itself seemed to stick in my throat. Part of that smell, I was sure, had lingered here long before I was born. "Orders up, Carolyn." Frank's raspy voice drifted from behind the counter, barely more than a gust of wind in my head, blending with the clinking of dishes and the low murmur of the late-night news from the small TV hanging in the corner. I pushed a damp strand of hair from my forehead and winced when my fingers brushed the deepening bruise along my temple. Roy had lost his temper again yesterday. This time it was about the phone bill, or at least that's what he said. The memory of his shouting, the sudden sting of a slap, twisted my stomach, but I forced it down. I couldn't lose this job. Not now. Not when freedom was just $480 away. "Coming right up," I called, forcing a thin layer of cheer into my tired voice. The diner was nearly empty, only old Mrs. June, who came every Tuesday for chicken bites and cornbread, and a young couple whispering in the corner, sharing a milkshake like they'd stepped out of a scene from the 60s. The storm had kept most folks home, and if things stayed quiet like this, Frank might let me clock out early. The thought sank in my chest. Leaving early meant fewer tips, and fewer tips meant another week trapped in Roy's suffocating apartment. Another week of fear, another week avoiding his eyes, his footsteps, his moods. The bell above the glass door jingled, and a gust of cold air swept through, raising goosebumps along my arms. I turned, order pad ready in hand, and froze. The man who stepped in was drenched to the bone, rain dripping from his black leather jacket and tracing thin, glistening lines down the old tiled floor. His jeans were splattered with mud, his boots leaving heavy, wet prints behind. But it wasn't the soaked, rugged look that made me catch my breath. It was his eyes, dark brown, deep and cold, yet burning all at once. They locked on mine the moment he entered, and some buried instinct screamed danger. Still, another part of me felt strung tight by an unfamiliar current, like static humming beneath my skin. "Black coffee," he said, voice low and rough, as if it hadn't been used in years. I nodded, suddenly aware of the faded apron around my waist, the dark circles under my eyes, and how the harsh fluorescent light above must be exposing every line of exhaustion on my face. Turning away quickly, I busied myself with the coffee pot, grateful for the excuse to look anywhere but at him. From the corner of my eye, I saw him sit at the far end of the counter, tall, still, his gaze scanning every doorway, every shadowed corner, like a predator learning its territory. I could feel that gaze on my back, as tangible as a touch. When I set the cup down before him, his fingers brushed mine deliberately. I was sure of it. A spark shot straight up my arm, tightening at the nape of my neck. "Thanks," he murmured. He didn't smile, but something softened in his expression, barely there, like a ripple across still water. "Not a good night to be out driving," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Hardly anyone passes through in weather like this, especially on a motorcycle." One brow lifted. "How'd you know I ride?" I pointed to the worn leather jacket, frayed at the elbows. "Not just for fashion," I said. For the first time, a faint smile tugged at his lips, one that turned him from merely handsome into dangerously beautiful. "Good observation," he said. A thunderclap cracked through the night, and the lights flickered. For an instant, I caught a glint of metal beneath his jacket. My pulse stumbled. A gun? Or just my imagination, warped by too many late-night crime shows? "You all right?" he asked, and I realized I'd been staring at his chest. "I'm fine," I lied quickly, stepping back behind the counter. Just startled. The young couple in the corner waved for their check, and I welcomed the distraction, retreating toward them. Still, I could feel his eyes on me, tracking every movement, every gesture, as if memorizing them. And deep down, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tonight, my life had just shifted, whether I wanted it to or not. My hands trembled slightly as I counted change for the couple. They left the diner laughing softly, fingers intertwined, blissfully unaware of the darker corners of the world. The glass door closed behind them, and once again, silence filled the space, just the dim light, the steady rain, and him. If you're still listening, maybe you can feel it too, the pull between Carolyn and that stranger, something both dangerous and undeniable. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this story so you won't miss the next chapter filled with mystery and emotion. I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Leave a comment below, tell us your city or your country, and let us know that Carolyn's journey through rain and longing has reached your heart, no matter where you are in the world. Matt. That's the name I heard when Frank spoke to him, but it was the way he looked at me, as if he saw through every crack I tried to hide, that haunted me. I turned back to the counter, pretending to be busy with the napkin dispenser, avoiding his eyes. My heart was still beating too fast, not just from fear, but from something else quietly rising inside me. His tall, silent, intense presence seemed to thicken the air, and what worried me most was the realization that I didn't want him to leave. That thought stopped me cold. What was I thinking? I should be afraid of him, a stranger, clearly dangerous, maybe even armed, but there was someone I feared more. Roy. My husband. No, let's call him what he was. The man who imprisoned me inside the tiny apartment I once believed was safe after losing my first husband. I met Roy 3 years ago, after James died of pancreatic cancer. I was broken, exhausted, and Roy was patient, gentle, or so I thought. But the sweetness was a thin layer of smoke that soon cleared, revealing a man who needed control like oxygen, who lashed out over the smallest things. He didn't hit me at first. No, Roy was smart. He turned up the heat slowly, like a frog in cool water brought to a boil. By the time I realized it, it was too late. My family was gone. My friends had drifted away. Roy didn't like me going out. I had no money for a lawyer, no one to call. I still remember the first time he hit me. One quick slap, then flowers, an apology, a promise it would never happen again. Then came the second time, and after that, there were no apologies. Every morning I woke up gauging his mood, learning how to breathe the right way, how to move without drawing attention. Every time I opened the door to our apartment, I whispered to myself, just hold on a little longer, just earn enough to leave. I'd been saving my tips, one by one, in a small tin box hidden behind the gas stove. $480 left. Such a small number for most people, but to me, it was everything. Freedom, hope, a way out of this rotting town where the sheriff was Roy's cousin, and every word I said would only turn into evidence against me. I'd thought about running before, but fear always stopped me. Fear of being found, dragged back, seeing his eyes when he realized I'd tried to escape. But sometimes, like tonight, when the rain fell steady and the yellow diner light glowed against my calloused hands, something stirred inside me, something like a dream. The dream of waking up one morning without fear, of hearing music without being told to turn it off, of living, not just surviving. I glanced toward the far end of the counter. Matt, something about the way he watched everything, the way he sat so still that the air itself seemed to fold around him, made me think he too was running from something. A stranger, on a storm-soaked night, drinking coffee as if he belonged to another world entirely, and that world had just collided with mine. Maybe this would be only one night. Maybe he'd leave once his coffee went cold. But that look, that brief touch, that gaze that seemed to ask me what I truly wanted, all of it, awakened a part of me I thought had long since died. The part that still dared to dream. The part that still wanted to be free. I had barely pushed thoughts of Roy into the darkest corner of my mind when the bell above the door rang again, sharp, insistent, cutting through the rain. My heart jumped to my throat. I looked up and froze. Roy stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm, dripping wet. He wasn't looking at the menu. His eyes, bloodshot and furious, were locked on me, then shifted, burning into the back of the stranger sitting at my counter. Matt didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders tense. His fingers rested lightly on the rim of his coffee cup, motionless. Roy didn't come all the way in. He just pushed the door open, letting a gust of cold, wet wind rush past him. "Getting off work late, huh, Carolyn?" He sneered, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Don't be dawdling." He stared hard at Matt's back for another second before slamming the door shut, the bell crashing violently. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. I stood trembling, wiping the spotless surface again and again just to keep my hands occupied. Now Roy knew. He knew I was here with another man. The dread I'd been suppressing coiled tight in my stomach. Matt sat motionless before his cup of coffee, as though waiting for something to rise from its depths. He hadn't taken a single sip. His fingers rested lightly on the rim, letting the heat seep into his skin before it disappeared somewhere inside him. I stood behind the counter, wiping the spotless surface again and again just to keep my trembling hands occupied. Even without looking at me, his presence filled the room like a silent awareness standing just behind my shoulder. I didn't know why it mattered so much. Maybe because I'd spent years living on alert, tuned to every shift in sound and movement like an animal that survived by instinct. But there was nothing threatening in Matt, the way there was in Roy. His silence wasn't the kind that held back anger ready to explode. It was a deeper stillness, as if he could hear the entire world breathing between seconds. "You been working here long?" His voice broke through the quiet. I froze, then met his eyes steady, unhurried, but impossible to ignore. "Almost 6 years," I said softly, surprised by how small my voice sounded. "This place is where I held on when everything else fell apart." He nodded, just slightly, as though he understood more than I'd said. No follow-up questions, no curiosity, no pity. The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt gentler, easier to bear. My eyes drifted to his hands, rough, strong, the color of weathered earth, as if they'd carried something heavy and dangerous. Faint scars traced his knuckles, telling more stories than words ever could. No ring, no watch, no phone on the counter. A man stepping into a diner on a stormy night, leaving no trace of the modern world behind. The more I thought about it, the more I knew I should walk away, not flee, just keep a safe distance. But my feet stayed rooted, and instead I heard myself ask, "Are you headed somewhere?" Matt raised an eyebrow, finding the question more interesting than expected. "Not really," he said after a pause. "Just looking for a place to stop for a while." He took a sip of coffee, closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. The taste seemed to please him. I didn't understand why his answer tightened something in my chest. There was truth in that tone, not politeness, but confession, like a man pausing himself in the middle of a long, weary journey. I studied him longer than I should have, searching for something that might make me feel safe. But the more I looked, the more I realized how much I didn't know. The weathered face, the guarded eyes, the silence that seemed carefully measured. A man like him didn't simply appear in a small town where everyone knew everyone, not in a place where the streets emptied after dark. A man like that wasn't just a biker waiting for the rain to pass. What had he seen in me? I had the sense that he knew I was hiding something, the same way I knew he wasn't telling the whole truth either. My fingers brushed my hair, grazing the bruise at my temple. The sting made me flinch, and a second later I felt his gaze land exactly there. I turned away quickly, pretending to busy myself with the shelves behind me, but it was too late. He'd seen. I didn't dare look back at him. I wasn't afraid he'd ask. I was afraid that if he did, I wouldn't be able to keep everything I'd buried for so many years from spilling out. Silence returned, heavier than before. I could hear the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain, the creak of leather as he shifted. Every small movement he made etched sharply into the quiet. In that stillness, I realized something both simple and terrifying. This man, Matt, was reading me as easily as he might read the surface of a steaming cup of coffee, and for reasons I couldn't name, that made me want to run and yet not want him to leave. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming on the tin roof like hundreds of impatient fingers. Lightning flashed through the window, glinting off puddles on the worn tile floor. I stood behind the counter pretending to study the stack of receipts, though the words blurred into nothing. I could feel Matt's gaze on me, steady and unseen, making my pulse race not from fear, but from that strange tension you feel when you stand too close to fire, knowing you shouldn't reach out, yet unable to resist its warmth. Then, without warning, the diner went dark. The TV snapped off. The fluorescent lights died in an instant, and silence swallowed everything. Only the rain kept falling, heavy and relentless, and my heartbeat pounded like a drum in my chest. I startled so hard that I dropped the pen in my hand. It rolled across the floor and vanished into the dark. "Oh no, power's out," I whispered, fumbling under the counter for the flashlight I always kept there for emergencies. As I searched, I heard the faint scrape of a chair. Matt was standing. He didn't say a word, just moved toward me, the weight of his boots echoing through the floor, each step resonating somewhere deep inside me. My fingers found the flashlight, and I flicked the switch, but nothing. I shook it, tried again. Still dark. He stopped close enough that I could feel his breath stir the cold air between us. "Let me," he said quietly, his voice low and near, carrying warmth that cut through the chill. Before I could respond, his hand brushed the back of mine, a light, careful touch, as though he were asking permission without words. but the contact sent a shock through me, not from pain, but from the sudden tightening in my chest. My hand was cold, his was warm. For the first time in years, someone touched me without anger, without control, without punishment, just a touch, simple and calm, with a trace of gentleness. I let the flashlight rest in his palm. He turned it, twisted the base, and light bloomed a soft golden glow that spread through the room, spilling across his face. For the first time I saw him clearly. The high cheekbones, the strong jaw, the depth in his eyes, and the way his lips pressed together as if holding back something vast and unspoken. He set the flashlight on the counter, its beam angled toward the kitchen, but he didn't step away. He stood there, half in light, half in shadow, watching me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but my throat closed up, no sound coming out. In the dim light, I saw his gaze drift once more to the bruise on my temple. This time, he didn't ask, didn't look away. He simply lifted his hand slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to startle me, and his fingers brushed the skin beside the bruise, not touching it directly, just close enough for me to feel the warmth. I stood still, every muscle locked. That touch, light as a feather, sent a shiver racing down my spine. There were no words of comfort, no questions, no hollow advice that outsiders often offer, just a touch. Yet within that touch lay an acknowledgement that he had seen, that he understood, that he would not judge. I blinked, and a single drop slid down my cheek. I couldn't tell if it was rain or a tear. Matt withdrew his hand slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. For a brief moment, in the half-light, with the flashlight's glow and the endless rain outside, something fragile began to form between two strangers, something without a name, yet enough for me to know that tonight would not be just another stormy night, and I would no longer be the woman who bowed her head in silence, wiping tables as the world passed by. I hadn't even steadied my breath after that almost unbearable touch, when the sound of dragging slippers echoed from behind the kitchen door. Frank poked his head out, the beam from Matt's flashlight glinting off his thick glasses, making his eyes flash like two small embers in the dark. "Power's out for real," he grumbled, holding a smaller flashlight that flickered weakly. I straightened, stepping quickly toward the sink, pretending to wipe something down, trying to hide the confusion still written on my face. Frank glanced at his watch and sighed. "Go on home, Carolyn. Doubt we'll see another customer tonight. Rain like this'll last till morning." I opened my mouth to protest but stopped. Going home meant going back to that cold apartment where Roy might be sitting in the dark, cigarette burning red between his fingers, eyes sharp as knives. No, not tonight. "Thank you," I murmured, pretending to agree, while my mind raced for another plan. I could linger a little longer, but Frank always locked up right after the last worker left. The only other person was Matt. He still sat quietly at the counter, the beam of light catching the edge of his cheekbone, sharpening his face into something distant and untouchable. And yet, somehow, that distance felt safe. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. "Matt," I said softly. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine as if he already knew what I was about to say. Outside, the rain still pounded, wind lashing the windows until they trembled like the size of an old house. I'm supposed to leave soon," I began, my voice catching. "But if you don't have a place to stay tonight." I hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't make me sound reckless. "There's a small house a few blocks from here. The landlady's a friend of mine. She rents out rooms by the day, mostly to truck drivers passing through. I have a spare key. If you'd like, I could take you there. It's just, no one else is staying there tonight." I added the last line quietly, almost apologetically, as if to prove I wasn't implying anything I shouldn't. Matt didn't respond right away. He just looked at me steadily, deeply, as though weighing something much heavier than a place to sleep. I couldn't read what was behind his eyes, but this time, I didn't look away. I'd spent too many years lowering my gaze, and somehow, standing straight beneath that look felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I thought was gone. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you." His voice was still low, still reserved, but it wasn't cold. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, unsure whether it was relief that he'd agreed or relief that I wouldn't have to return to that dark apartment alone. I gathered my things, untied my apron, grabbed my coat and purse. Before leaving, I told Frank I'd walk the last customer to Mrs. Mildred's boarding house. He just nodded without a word, his focus fixed on the fading beam of his flashlight, as though it were the last bit of life left in the world. When we stepped outside, The wind slapped against my face, sharp and sobering. Rain fell hard and fast, and Matt walked beside me without a word. I gripped the keys in my pocket, my heart hammering. I didn't know where this night would lead me, but I knew one thing. I had chosen not to go back into the familiar darkness. And the man walking next to me, though still a mystery, made me believe that for the first time in years, I was walking toward the light. The storm raged on, pouring its anger over the small, sleeping town as Matt and I hurried along the gravel path leading to Mrs. Mildred's place. The rain stung like needles, but I didn't stop. My hand was freezing around the keyring, yet my chest burned with something I didn't dare to name. Matt walked in silence beside me, his steps steady and sure. He carried no umbrella, didn't flinch from the cold. He only pulled his leather collar higher and kept his eyes forward, as though the storm was nothing compared to what he'd already survived. I pushed open the rusty iron gate that led into the small wooden house's yard. Mildred's house, the one she rented to travelers passing through. She always let me keep a spare key, in case someone arrived late. When I opened the door, the scent of damp wood and floor cleaner lingered faintly in the air. I flipped the light switch, and a soft amber glow spilled across the dark, stained walls. Everything was clean, orderly, and so quiet that I could hear the rain dripping from the eaves outside. Matt stood by the doorway, not crossing the threshold. The light caught his face, drawing lines of brightness and shadow, like a painting that hid its meaning in every brushstroke. "It's safe here," I said, trying to sound casual. "Mrs. Mildred lives a few houses down. If anything happens, you can reach her easily." He still didn't speak. His eyes didn't wander around the room as I expected. They stayed on me. On my temple, specifically, where the faint purple of a fading bruise still showed. I realized, too late, that I'd pushed my hood back, revealing what I'd tried so long to keep hidden. I raised my hand to cover it, but Matt stepped forward. Not fast, not sudden, but enough to make me lift my head to meet his eyes. They weren't the calm, distant eyes from the diner anymore. They had changed, something storming behind them, fierce but not aimed at me. "No one should ever do that to you," he said. His voice was low, rough, but each word landed with the weight of iron on stone. It wasn't a question. It wasn't pity. It was a decree, a truth that left no room for argument. I stood there, heart pounding, unaccustomed to anyone speaking for me. For years, I had swallowed every pain in silence, and now, a man I'd met only hours ago looked at me as if the bruise on my skin were a wound on his own. He lifted his hand slowly, cautiously, as if afraid I might flinch, but I didn't. For the first time, I let someone come close. His fingers brushed the skin beside the bruise, not over it, but near enough for me to feel the warmth. The touch was steady, deliberate, but never forceful. I saw his brow tighten slightly, as though he were holding something back. He withdrew his hand after a few seconds, but in that moment, it felt as if an unspoken promise had passed between us. No one would ever hurt me again. Not while this man still stood here. I stepped back, my hand gripping the edge of the wooden table behind me for balance. He didn't move closer, didn't invade my space. He just stood there, silent, his eyes fixed on me as though waiting for me to decide what came next. I knew he had a past. I could see it in his eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen betrayal, loss, and blood. But I also knew that in this cold, rain-soaked night, he was the only man who didn't make me afraid. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone inside a room locked against the world. I was here, and he hadn't turned away. Neither of us were just passing through each other's storm anymore. Once I was sure Matt was settled inside the small boarding house, I quietly stepped back out. "You're sure you'll be safe?" Matt's voice was low, stopping me just as I reached for the door. I couldn't meet his eyes. I just nodded, pulling my coat tighter. "I'll be fine. Thank you, Matt. For everything." I locked the door carefully behind me, the sound of the bolt echoing in the quiet night. The wind slapped cold against my face as I hurried along the narrow street toward the apartment I still called home. What I didn't know was that Matt hadn't stayed settled. He was a man who recognized danger, and he had seen it not just in the fading bruise on my temple, but in the sheer terror in my eyes when I spoke of going home. The simple lock on the boarding house door was nothing to him. He had slipped out seconds after me, his steps silent in the rain. He kept to the shadows, a block behind, watching me, ensuring I made it. When I disappeared into my apartment building, he didn't leave. He found cover in the alley across the street, his instincts screaming that the night wasn't over. The building stood 2 stories high, the stairs up creaking under every step like they were tired of holding one more night's burden. My hands trembled as I pulled out the key. The door opened, and darkness swallowed me whole. I didn't switch on the light right away. I stood still, listening. Silence. No footsteps, no shifting furniture, no cigarette smoke. Maybe Roy wasn't home. Maybe, for once, he had actually gone away for a few days like he'd threatened that morning. I let out a quiet breath and turned on the kitchen light. The dim yellow glow spilled over the peeling walls. I hung up my coat, kicked off my shoes, and opened the refrigerator, empty except for a cracked carton of eggs and half a bottle of water. I reached for a glass, about to pour, when the back door creaked open. I froze. I knew that sound. Before I could turn, a voice hoarse, cold, and all too familiar spoke behind me. "Where were you this late?" I turned slowly. Roy stood there, soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes bloodshot and blazing like a lit match about to catch. He slammed the door shut, the sound cracking through the small space like a gunshot. I tried to steady my voice. "I worked late. Power went out, so Frank let me go after closing." Roy stepped closer, each heavy footfall sinking into the floor. "Worked late, huh? Then why did I see you with another man? You think I don't know what you've been doing behind my back? You think you can fool me, Carolyn?" I stepped backward until my spine met the edge of the counter. My heart pounded, not from surprise but from the grim certainty that this moment was always coming. He'd followed me. Maybe he'd seen me walk Matt to the boarding house. "I didn't do anything wrong," I said. "I just helped a customer find a place to stay. He's not who you think he is." The words barely left my mouth before I knew I'd made a mistake. Roy roared, his face twisting, hand shooting forward to grab me, but I slipped past him, bolting toward the living room. He chased me, kicking over a broken chair, hurling the bottle he'd been holding at the wall. Glass shattered, sharp and final. "You think you can leave me? You think you can just walk away after everything I've done for you? I gave you a home, I fed you, and now you dare betray me?" My throat was dry, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone on the table. But Roy was faster. He ripped it from my grip and slammed it to the floor, shattering it into pieces. I backed away, hands raised not to fight, but to beg. "Please don't, Roy. Please." But his eyes no longer saw me. They burned red with a rage I couldn't reason with. I knew, in that instant, that if no one stopped him, tonight might be my last night alive in this apartment. And there was only one name in my mind: Matt. I edged backward until the wall stopped me. Roy advanced, madness twisting his face. "You lying whore," he spat, the words cutting through me. His hand came up fast, too fast for me to react. Across the street, Matt had heard the shouting escalate. He'd heard the distinct crash of shattered glass. He was already moving before my scream even began, crossing the street in seconds and hitting the apartment door with his full weight. Just before Roy's hand could fall, the front door burst open with a crash that shook the room. Roy spun around. I froze. Matt stood in the doorway, drenched in rain, his eyes alive with a fury that filled the room like fire. One look from him made even Roy hesitate. Roy turned toward him, ready to lash out, but Matt moved first, swift and precise, like a blade slicing through air. In one motion, he caught Roy's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him face first against the wall. Roy's cry of pain tore through the room. "Who the hell are you?" he spat, struggling. "You think you can come in here and tell me how to handle my woman?" Matt said nothing at first, holding him firm, his movements clean, controlled, professional. I'd never seen anyone move like that, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Every gesture was exact, deliberate, like a man who'd done this many times before. "Carolyn is a person," Matt said finally, his voice low and hard as steel grinding against stone. "Not property, not yours to hit." Roy's eyes bulged, his breath ragged, still cursing but losing strength. He tried to twist free, but it was useless. He wasn't strong enough. Not against someone like Matt. Then, just as suddenly, Matt released him. Roy fell forward, hitting the edge of the coffee table with a sharp, cracking thud. He groaned, one hand clutching his forehead, his expression twisted in pain and humiliation. "I'll sue you," he spat. "I'll call the cops. You'll regret touching me." Matt stepped closer, leaning down, his voice lower now, dangerous, steady, the kind that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. Go ahead, but I swear, if you ever touch her again, I'll make sure you disappear, and no one will ever find you." Roy stared up at him, and for the first time, I saw it real fear. Matt turned toward me, and the fire in his eyes softened instantly, as though none of it had happened. "Are you all right?" he asked. I shook my head, unable to form words. I didn't cry, but my eyes burned. Too many feelings collided at once: fear, shock, relief, and something that felt achingly close to being protected. Something I'd forgotten how to feel for far too long. Matt stepped closer and laid a hand gently on my shoulder, a touch light enough to tell me he was there. I reached for his hand not to hold him back, but to feel the warmth of someone I barely knew, yet somehow already understood was the reason I was still standing. Roy lay on the floor, groaning in his defeat, while I, for the first time in years, was no longer afraid of the darkness pressing in around me, because I knew that within that darkness, someone had walked in and pulled me out, not like a hero, but like a man who truly saw me and chose not to look away. The wail of police sirens sliced through the steady rain, sharp and electric, cutting into the heavy silence that hung over the apartment. Blue and red lights flickered through the fogged window pane, painting the cracked walls with trembling patches of color. I stood beside Matt, my hand still gripping his without realizing it, as if letting go might cause me to shatter under the weight of everything still shaking inside me. Roy had managed to sit up, slumped against the couch, a hand clutching his head, his face pale but his eyes still burning, not weak, but calculating. He had made the call, and I knew exactly who would answer it: Sheriff Gaines. The front door opened again, and just as I expected, the familiar figure appeared, cowboy hat tilted low, worn uniform hanging loose at the shoulders. He entered without knocking, without hesitation, like this place belonged to him. His gaze swept the room, pausing on me, then Roy, then finally on Matt. "Carolyn, what's going on here?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Before I could answer, Roy spoke first, his tone feigning weakness but every word sharpened with intent. "He broke into my house, attacked me. I didn't even get the chance to defend myself before he hit me. He threatened me in front of my wife." Matt didn't flinch. He just stood there, eyes cold, unblinking, fixed on the sheriff. I drew in a deep breath, forcing my voice to steady. Roy broke in. "You know this place is rented under my name. I reported it last year. He doesn't have a key. He has no right to be here. I came home and found him about to hit me." Matt stepped in. Sheriff Gaines slowly removed his gloves and walked farther into the room. "No one seriously hurt," he said after a pause. "No blood. No witnesses beyond the three of you. I need to hear both sides." Matt's mouth curved slightly, not into a smile but something harder. "If I hadn't come when I did, there wouldn't be two sides to hear." Gaines studied him, his eyes narrowing as though measuring each word, each breath. Then he turned to me, his tone softening only slightly. "Carolyn, I've known you for years, and I don't want to meddle in personal matters, but bringing a stranger into your home doesn't help things. Don't make this worse for yourself." I swallowed hard, feeling the quiet omission behind his words, the unspoken fact that he was Roy's cousin, and always would be. Matt stayed silent beside me, but I could sense the tension beneath his stillness, the part of him holding something back I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Gaines turned to Roy. "You pressing charges?" Roy rubbed his forehead, glancing from me to Matt. "No, don't bother. I just want him out. I'm not wasting my time on someone like him." The sheriff nodded once, then faced Matt. "I don't know who you are, but around here, we handle things our own way. Don't stir up trouble. This isn't the place for heroes." Matt didn't respond. He met the sheriff's eyes with a look so steady, so unyielding, that even Gaines faltered for a heartbeat before turning away and pulling his gloves back on. "Have a quiet night," he muttered, and left, the air thickening in his wake. I exhaled, my legs weak beneath me, while Matt remained still, his gaze fixed on the door that had just closed. I knew he wasn't afraid of Sheriff Gaines. I knew he wasn't the kind of man to let a threat go unanswered. But for me, he'd stayed silent. And that silence told me more than words ever could that he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not until the sound of a knock on the door no longer made me flinch. One day later, after Roy's outburst and the sheriff's icy visit, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, eyes locked on the winding road ahead. Matt sat beside me, watching the rearview mirror as if the darkness itself might sprout legs and follow. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving behind a morning heavy with fog and cold, the sky a dull shade of ash hiding something it refused to reveal. We hadn't spoken much since leaving town, but the silence between us didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful, more comforting than any conversation I'd ever had with Roy. No shouting, no suspicion, no threats, just the hum of the engine, the whisper of wind through the window crack, and the quiet rhythm of my heartbeat finally beginning to slow after so many days of fear. Matt said he knew a place, a safe spot to lie low for a few days, away from town and prying eyes. When I asked where, he simply said it belonged to someone who owed him a favor. We drove for nearly 2 hours, winding through mountain roads, dense pine forests, and hairpin turns hugging the cliffs. The higher we climbed, the colder the air grew, clean and sharp, as if every bit of pain and dust from the town below was being washed away. When the car turned onto a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for one vehicle, my pulse quickened not from fear, but from the strange anticipation of whatever waited ahead. The cabin appeared behind a curtain of pines like a forgotten dream. A 2-story wooden lodge tucked into the slope of the mountain, its moss-covered roof slanting low, a stone chimney still whispering smoke. A wide porch wrapped around the house, with a swing and a long table under the awning. Beyond, a valley stretched out in gold and crimson hues of autumn, the trees shimmering beneath a thin veil of mist, a stream winding softly through the mossy rocks below. I didn't know how long I'd been holding my breath, only that something deep within me, a part that had long forgotten the shape of peace, stirred awake. Matt got out first, walked around, and opened the door for me. As I stepped out, the mountain wind brushed against my face, carrying the scent of pine, damp wood, and faint traces of smoke from the hearth inside. He handed me the keys, but then unlocked the door himself, as though this place somehow belonged to him. Inside, the cabin was simple yet warm, everything tidy beneath a fine layer of dust untouched, but never abandoned. The living room held a large armchair draped with a fur blanket, an old bookshelf, and a stone fireplace stacked neatly with wood. A few oil paintings hung on the walls, landscapes, maybe painted by someone who loved this place enough to capture it forever. The small kitchen was stocked with essentials, a brass kettle resting on the gas stove. A wooden staircase led to the loft where 2 small bedrooms faced the whispering pines outside. I stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed, unable to speak. Matt didn't ask if I liked it. He just set my bag down, then stepped over to light the fire. Within minutes, the room filled with a soft golden glow, and the crackle of burning wood sounded like the mountain's lullaby. For the first time in so long, I didn't feel the need to brace myself. I didn't need to lower my head, or wait for an anger that might explode without warning. I sat in the chair near the fireplace, the blanket pulled over my lap, and turned to look at Matt. He stood by the window, the dim light tracing the sharp line of his profile, his thoughts hidden from me. But one thing I knew for certain: I was no longer in hell. And maybe, just maybe, I had stepped into a beginning I'd never dared to imagine. The first days in the mountain cabin felt unreal, like I was dreaming a dream too fragile to wake from. Each morning I awoke in the small pine-paneled room, the sheets still warm, sunlight seeping through the curtains in long, gentle streaks across the wall. No traffic roaring, no hurried footsteps, no sudden shouting that made me flinch. Only the wind whispering through the trees and birds calling across the forest. Matt was always up before me. He cooked, quietly, without show or fuss, moving with the calm precision of someone long used to caring for others. The smell of roasted coffee filled the small kitchen, and when I came down, 2 cups were always waiting, one for him, one for me, alongside a plate of fried eggs or toast with peanut butter. I used to think men like Matt, with their rough edges, their weary eyes, their guarded posture, knew only how to drive fast or fight hard, but he peeled apples deftly, chopped vegetables with smooth, exact strokes, and washed dishes with patient care. He said little, but every gesture was deliberate, from straightening a crooked tablecloth to adjusting a chair so it sat square again. I found myself watching him more, not from suspicion, but from a quiet curiosity, because I'd never seen silence hold so much presence before. His being there made the cabin feel alive, filled not with words or affection, but with a safety I had never known. Even the smallest things, a log placed into the fire, a window opened to let in light, shifted something within me. At first, I wasn't used to it. When he passed behind me, I still tensed. When he reached for a cup near where I stood, I instinctively stepped aside. The old fear lingered like a shadow I carried everywhere. But Matt never crossed the line. He always kept a respectful distance. No reaching, no pressing, no questions I wasn't ready to answer. And maybe that was why. One afternoon as we sat on the porch, me holding a mug of hot tea, him sharpening a kitchen knife against a small stone, I finally spoke. "I used to have a dog," I said, eyes drifting toward the mist-covered valley. "His name was Toby. Roy kicked him to death because he barked while he was napping." Matt paused, just for a heartbeat. He didn't speak, but I saw his hand tighten slightly on the knife handle. In that silence, I knew I had done the right thing by telling him. After that day, I spoke more. Little by little, I shared the fragments I had hidden away, the small humiliations, the bruises that had faded, the memories too painful to remember until now. And Matt listened. Just listened. No overreaching sympathy, no reckless anger. He was as still as stone, yet a stone I knew would never crumble beneath my weight. Eventually, he began to speak too. Not much, never in full detail, but enough for me to understand who he had been, what he had done, and why he'd chosen to walk away from it all. One night, as we cooked dinner together, he handed me a small knife to slice the vegetables. Our hands brushed. It wasn't intentional, but I didn't pull away. I looked at him, and he looked at me. Neither of us said a word, yet something shifted quietly between us. Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It builds from the small things, the repeated gestures, the steady gaze that doesn't turn away, the silences that fill with truth instead of fear. I once believed I'd never open my heart again. But here, in the stillness of the mountains, with mornings scented by coffee and pine, I began to believe that some people don't come to stay forever, they come when you need them most. And Matt had come that way, no promises, no plans, just a presence that reminded me I was still human, still deserving of gentleness. That night, the air grew colder than before. Mountain wind sighed through the cracks in the windows, and the fire burned low, glowing red in the hearth. Matt and I sat together in the large armchair draped with fur, the room so quiet I could hear the wood settling under the heat and my own heartbeat, slow and steady, inside my chest. He poured himself another drink, whiskey dark and smoky, the kind I could never take more than a sip of, but he drank it slowly, as if he needed the pause between each swallow to find his thoughts. "Do you ever wonder," he said at last, eyes fixed on the flames, "if someone knew who you really were, they'd never look at you the same again?" I turned toward him but didn't answer. It wasn't a question that needed words. It was a door he'd just opened, and I understood that if I stepped through it with him, there would be no going back. He was silent for a long time, long enough that I thought he'd let it pass. But then his voice came again, rough and low as the mountain wind. He told me he'd once run a branch of an organization, not the kind of mafia you see in movies, but close enough that everyone involved carried stains that would never wash clean. He'd grown up in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood where laws were written with fists and loyalty. As a young man, he believed power was the only shield against being crushed. He climbed fast, fueled by coldness and an uncanny ability to see weakness in others. He told me there'd been a time he'd stood before a man who'd betrayed them, gun in hand, and felt nothing at all, just another task, another transaction. Until the day the only person he trusted was killed in an internal purge. When he saw that blood pooling on the concrete, he knew he'd gone too far. He walked away, vanished. Since then, he'd kept moving, never staying anywhere long, never letting anyone get too close. Until he met me. I didn't know what to say for the first few minutes after hearing it all. The words, "I once pulled the trigger," echoed in my head, and I could see him, the man who now made me breakfast, standing in some Brooklyn alley thick with smoke and blood, his eyes cold and empty. But when I looked at him again, the coldness was gone. In its place was the quiet weariness of someone who had carried too much for too long, someone who now only wanted to be understood. "You don't have to say anything," Matt said with a faint smile, his voice dissolving into the crackle of the fire. "I just thought, if you knew everything, maybe you'd decide you shouldn't trust me." I pulled my hand from the blanket and placed it on his, not to comfort, but to share the weight of it. "Matt," I said softly, "I never thought I'd tell anyone this, but I have a past too, and if people knew it, they might call me weak, foolish, or worse." I told him about my husband, a man with manners, charm, and a polished way of speaking, the kind that made everyone believe I was the lucky one. But things changed after the wedding. The small humiliations, the controlling glances, the silent punishments for not smiling wide enough or not wearing the color he liked. Then came the slaps, the nights I stayed awake too afraid to sleep, terrified I'd wake to find myself locked outside on the balcony. I endured it for nearly 3 years, never brave enough to leave until now. And courage, I told him, doesn't come from strength, it comes from despair. Once you've hit the bottom, you stop fearing the fall. Matt didn't speak, but his fingers closed gently around mine, not to say he understood everything, but to say he would stay, no matter what I told him. In that moment, 2 people with bruised histories sat together in a cabin deep in the woods, needing no promises, no rescue, only the comfort of knowing they no longer had to hide the ugliest parts of themselves. And sometimes, that is where love truly begins. The air inside the wooden cabin felt still after the words we shared. Outside, the wind sighed softly through the cracks of the window, bringing a chill that crept across the floorboards, but I didn't feel cold. The firelight glowed steadily, casting flickering patterns across the walls and over Matt's face, his eyes never leaving me since I'd spoken of my husband. Neither of us said another word. We simply sat there, shoulder to shoulder, our breaths mingling in a silence so gentle it almost felt sacred. I realized I had never known peace like this, never sat beside someone whose presence didn't make me brace for pain. There's a rhythm that exists between 2 people when every facade falls away, leaving only what's raw and true, tired, wounded, yet still aching to be loved right. That's what Matt was to me in that moment. When he turned toward me, his eyes no longer burdened by the past but filled with something tender and impossibly human, I felt myself changing too. I was no longer the trembling woman who stepped out of the shadows of a broken marriage, but someone learning to lift her head again, to believe she deserved peace. When Matt raised his hand and brushed his fingers against my cheek, I didn't flinch. His touch was warm, his rough fingertips grazing my skin like a question unspoken, yet honest. I tilted my head slightly, my hand finding his wrist, holding it there, my answer given without words. The space between us thinned until it was as fragile as breath. His eyes met mine, waiting for a sign, a nod, any small permission, and I didn't look away. I don't know who leaned in first, only that when his lips met mine, the world seemed to still. It wasn't a hungry kiss, not desperate or rushed, but soft, careful, carrying more than words could hold. I closed my eyes and tasted the smoke of the fire on his lips, bitter, yet sweet, like a promise that pain could heal. Matt's hand slid to the back of my neck, drawing me closer but never breaking the gentleness between us. I let myself fall into him, my fingers gripping the fabric of his sweater as if afraid he'd disappear with the flame. In his arms, I could hear his heartbeat, not fast, but steady, grounding, and I felt my own fall into rhythm with his. When we finally parted, we said nothing. Matt rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my cheek, so familiar it made my throat tighten. He looked at me for a long time before whispering, his voice low and rough as the midnight wind through the pines. "I'm not in a hurry. I'll wait." I nodded, not sure if the wetness on my face was from tears or the warmth between us. All I knew was that from that moment on, I was no longer walking alone through my memories. I had him. And for someone who had lived in silence for so long, that alone felt like a miracle. The next morning, snow began to fall, soft flakes dusting the porch roof, settling like white lace on the pine branches outside the window, turning the world into a quiet winter postcard. I had just poured coffee when Matt stepped in from the porch, his coat covered in snow, his boots muddy and soaked, but his eyes, usually calm, were sharp and unsettled. He set the bundle of firewood down, brushed off the snow from his shoulders, and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, laying it on the table without a word. I looked at him, then down at the page. It was a printed article from a local news site. The headline was short but chilling. Police investigating violent Dr. Ferter with criminal record after local assault. Beneath it was a blurred photograph of Matt taken from behind his leather jacket and unmistakable stride impossible to mistake. My hands trembled as I set the paper down. "Who did this?" I asked. Matt didn't meet my eyes. "Roy," he said flatly. "He fed it to the local press. He must have worked with Gaines to invent a criminal record for me. Said I was a dangerous drifter and that you were being manipulated." My chest tightened, breath catching. The fragile trust we'd built, the fragile peace, threatened to collapse under a few printed lies and a shadowed image. But I knew the truth. And I knew Roy. He didn't need proof, only the poison of doubt. "What do we do now?" I asked. Matt stood motionless, his silence heavy. Then he said the sheriff had already made contact, not directly, but through the cabin's owner, leaving word that if Carolyn Harmon and the mysterious man were still in the mountains, deputies would come check in. No warrant, no charges, but enough to make us understand we were being watched. I leaned back in the chair, pressing my fingers to my temples, my head throbbing as the old feeling crept in again, the hunted feeling. Matt sat across from me, his voice steady but firm. "I can leave if you want. I don't want to drag you into this. You still have a chance to go back, explain things to the police, live a normal life without me." I stared at him for a long moment, feeling something break open inside, not anger but sorrow, the kind that comes when someone you care for believes they're a burden. "I don't want to live a life where I have to bow my head and hide behind other people's comfort," I said quietly. "I've done that already. For too long. If I have to keep living without truth, without someone who sees me, then that isn't living at all." Matt's hand tightened gently around mine beneath the table. He didn't speak, but in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before, a quiet tremor of emotion that reached me deeper than words could. Outside, the snow was still falling, but inside, I no longer felt cold. We both knew the calm wouldn't last much longer. I'd started noticing the gray car parked across the valley for 2 days straight. Matt said someone had been asking questions at the gas station down by the mountain road. Names, descriptions, times of arrival, questions no one would ask unless they had a reason. Matt wasn't afraid, but he was careful. Every night, he locked the doors, dimmed the lights, and kept a flashlight beside the bed. He didn't sleep as soundly as before. I could see how his body stayed alert, his senses half awake. I began keeping my old phone close too, charging it each night, saving the numbers for the police and for Mildred, the landlady of the lodge. Every morning, when I met Matt's eyes, I didn't see fear there, only readiness. He wasn't running, and neither was I, because this time, I wasn't alone. This time, I wasn't the woman curled in a corner, waiting for the storm to pass. I was standing beside a man the world wanted to misunderstand, simply because he didn't fit their mold. And if anyone came asking about him, I would tell them the truth, that he was the first man who ever taught me what it meant to be trusted, to be heard, to be loved without having to sacrifice who I was. That evening, after we ate in silence under the soft gold light of the kitchen lamp, Matt stepped out onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee. I watched him through the window, his silhouette framed against the fresh snow, still and solitary, as if he were gathering the weight of the world into a single thought. I knew he was about to tell me something important, not by intuition, but by the way he took a slow sip, set his cup down on the railing, and stood perfectly still, as though caught between 2 roads with no way back. I put on my coat and went outside to stand beside him. The mountain wind was sharp and biting, but not as sharp as the anticipation curling in my chest. After a long silence, Matt turned to me, his eyes dark and deep like a winter lake. He said he had an old friend in Canada, someone who had helped him once when he walked away from the organization and still kept in touch. If we left that night, taking the mountain trail he knew, we could cross the border in less than a day. There, we could start over. No real names, no ties, no one knowing who we were. I stood still, imagining it a life reborn in some distant town, where I could open a small cafe, sell old books, live beside the man I loved without fear of stares or the ghosts of our past. But another picture formed too. A life spent running, always watching the rearview mirror, flinching at the sound of an unfamiliar engine outside the door. Matt said he wasn't afraid for himself. He'd lived too long with shadows at his heels. What scared him was the thought of me losing myself, of waking one day and seeing in him not the man who saved me, but the stain of everything I was trying to leave behind. We had 2 choices, he said. Disappear, vanish from Roy's reach, and those who hunted him, and live a life we never had to justify, or go back, face the town, the whispers, the stares, the police. Face Roy. And the truth. Matt told me he would let me choose, because for the first time in my life, I had the right to choose my own road to walk forward without bowing my head or hiding from the world. I sat on the porch chair, folding my arms around myself as though holding on to warmth that had nothing to do with the firelight. I thought of everything behind me, the blows, the silences, the nights spent half awake, terrified of the sound of a key turning in the lock. Then I thought of Matt, the way he set a glass of water in front of me every morning, the way he listened when I told him about a dog that no longer lived, the way he looked at me with eyes that asked for nothing but honesty. I lifted my head and met his gaze. My voice was quiet but certain. "I've been running all my life, Matt. From Roy, from my family, from myself. I don't want to run anymore." He didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, he nodded. No questions. No arguments. Just a simple nod. As if he'd known all along what my answer would be. He drew me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel weak. We sat there until the night wrapped around the mountains, our breaths mingling in the cold like an unspoken vow. Whatever came next, we wouldn't run. Not again. Because some things are worth standing for, and some people are worth standing beside, even when the whole world turns away. The next morning, the snow had stopped, but the sky hung low and heavy, gray as steel. The air in the cabin was so still I could hear the faint tick of the clock in the living room. Matt was outside tending the fire, and I stood before the mirror in the bedroom. The woman staring back at me was no longer the Carolyn from months ago, not the woman wiping down diner tables in the rain with a bruise on her temple and exhaustion in her eyes. I touched my cheek, remembering the moment I told Matt I wasn't going to run anymore. The words still echoed inside me, clear as my heartbeat had been when I said them. Something inside me had changed forever since meeting him. Not because he'd rescued me, but because he'd waited patiently for me to rescue myself. He hadn't built illusions or promised salvation. He had simply given me truth. And that truth was what made me believe I could begin again, not by fleeing, but by standing tall. I put on my coat and scarf and stepped out onto the porch, where Matt was stacking firewood. He turned toward me, that knowing look already in his eyes, the one that always seemed to see my thoughts before I spoke. "I want to go back to town," I said slowly, each word steady like a declaration to my own soul. "I want to tell the police everything Roy did. I want to testify. I don't care about the rumors, or the stares, or if people call me crazy or weak or a liar. I'm not afraid anymore." Matt didn't answer at once. He sat down, fingers interlaced, studying me for a long moment. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "You know it won't be easy. Many will side with Roy not because they believe him, but because change frightens them." I nodded, my heart pounding, but steady. "I know. But I'd rather face the truth than live another day in the dark just to keep others comfortable. I've lived like that long enough. I want to pull it out of me, piece by piece, until it's gone." Matt stepped closer and placed his hand on my shoulder. "Then I'll go with you," he said. I knew it wasn't a word of comfort. It was a commitment, a promise that needed no vows. We were about to step into a battle with no guarantee of victory, but this time, I was no longer alone. 3 days later, we drove back to town. I was behind the wheel, while Matt remained silent as always, occasionally glancing at me through the rearview mirror as if to make sure I was still all right. I wasn't fine in the ordinary sense of the word, but I was steady. For the first time in years, I felt that I was doing the right thing not to please anyone, but to free myself. When we walked into the police station, Sheriff Gaines saw us from a distance. He came out of his office, blocking our way, as if he still hoped to stop us before things went too far. "Carolyn," he said, "I think you should reconsider. Roy is still a citizen of this town. You have no proof, only your word. Denotation." I looked him straight in the eye, refusing to flinch. "Then I'll tell everything," I said. "I'll tell it in front of the prosecutor, in front of the court. I'll tell how Roy threatened me, broke into my house, nearly beat me to death, and if I have to, I'll tell them exactly who you are to him." I saw the sheriff's gaze falter for just a second, but he said nothing. Matt stood beside me, silent, yet his mere presence shifted the air in the room. I wrote my statement, signed my name, and left the station under the heavy silence of those watching from behind. When we reached the car, I turned back to look at the old red brick building once more. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe an investigation, a trial, many sleepless nights. But I knew one thing for certain. I had begun again. Not by running away this time, but by coming back. And this time, I would not let anyone define me by my fear. Less than 2 weeks after I filed the official complaint, Roy was arrested while trying to leave the state in a rental car under a false name. The news spread through town faster than lightning across a summer sky. Some people whispered behind my back at the grocery store. Some avoided meeting my eyes, but others took my hand and said they had believed me all along, they just hadn't found the courage to speak up. Older women who used to come by the diner where I once worked left small baskets of baked goods for me, a quiet way of saying they understood. Sheriff Gaines stopped appearing in public after the arrest, and though no one confirmed it, Everyone knew the investigation had uncovered years of shady dealings between him and Roy. The tired old town suddenly felt alive again, swept by a quiet wind of change, a feeling that justice, though late, had finally found its way home. As for me, I chose not to leave. I chose to stay not because I owed anything to the place that once held me captive, but because I wanted to turn it into proof that a person can rise from ruin, can rebuild from ashes. With my small savings, and a bit of unexpected help from Mrs. Mildred, the kind-hearted neighbor from the mountains, I rented an old red brick house on the corner. It used to be a grocery store in the 60s. The faded price signs were still visible on the walls, and the wooden floors creaked under every step. Matt helped me fix it up. We cleaned every shelf, repainted every wall, hung small amber lights across the ceiling, and placed worn but cozy wooden tables around the room. I named it Shelter, a Refuge, partly because it was a dream I once thought I would never have, and partly because I wanted it to be a place where anyone wounded or simply weary could find a quiet corner to breathe again. The small shop sold used books, hot coffee, and homemade pastries I learned to bake from the women who once supported me in silence. On autumn mornings, sunlight streamed through the front window, glinting off the spines of neatly lined novels. I stood behind the counter, holding a steaming cup of cappuccino, watching Matt adjust the door hinge or chat with regulars in his warm, low voice. He was no longer a man on the run. He was part of this place now, part of the healing we had built together. Sometimes I slipped little handwritten notes into the most popular books, quiet messages of hope for people I might never meet. Occasionally, someone would read one and tear up right there at the table. They didn't know who I used to be, and that no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had survived, and now I was living with meaning. One afternoon, as I was wiping down the counter, an elderly woman approached me with emotion in her voice. "Thank you for not leaving," she said. "This town needs people like you." I smiled, nodded, and said nothing, because I knew that smile was the answer. Peace, I've learned, doesn't come from avoiding storms. It comes from learning to stand in the middle of them and still keeping your heart warm. And here, among old books and the comforting scent of coffee, is where I found myself again. One early spring morning, when wildflowers began to bloom on the grassy patch outside our book and coffee shop, I stood behind the counter, holding a cup of chamomile tea, feeling something quietly different within me. Not pain, not fatigue, but a deep, unmistakable sense that something sacred had begun to grow inside. A week later, when the test results appeared clear on the clinic's paper, I sat in my car for a long time, holding the document in my hands, doing nothing but smiling. I was pregnant. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the future. For the first time, the road ahead wasn't a cliff, it was a path lined with promise and light. That evening, when Matt returned from his shift at the auto repair shop near town, I handed him the paper. He read it, silent, then looked up at me with a gaze I will never forget. There were no tears, no grand words, just an embrace so tight it felt like he had been given a gift he never dared to hope for. A week later, on a gentle, rainy afternoon, I was rearranging books on the shelf when Matt walked in holding a small box wrapped in simple linen paper. He didn't kneel, didn't plan anything elaborate. He just came closer, looked into my eyes, and said one sentence that made the whole world fall silent for a few heartbeats. "Will you walk with me not just in this life, but in every one after?" I laughed through my tears and nodded without hesitation, because I knew, amid all the uncertainty of life, one thing for sure: I wanted to grow old with this man, the one who had seen me in pieces and still loved me as if I had never been broken. We didn't have a grand wedding, just a few close friends, a handful of loyal customers from the shop, and a small tea party in the backyard, bathed in golden sunlight, with white ribbons hanging from tree branches. I wore a simple dress, my hand resting gently on my rounded belly, and when Matt took my hand in his, I knew I was living inside a dream I never needed to wake from. My story with Matt may have begun on a cold, rainy night, but it didn't end there. It continued through days filled with sunlight, with forgiveness, with courage, and with the simple, quiet moments of sitting side by side, reading under the soft glow of a golden lamp. It's a story about a woman who dared to leave behind her darkest past to find her own light, and a man who chose to walk away from power, from guilt, to learn how to love and be loved in a kind and honest way. Dear listener, if you've stayed with us until now, perhaps something in this story has touched a tender place in your heart. What do you think of it? Does it remind you of someone in your own life? Have you ever witnessed or lived through a journey of healing like this? We would love to hear your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Every word you share is a gift, a moment of connection that we deeply treasure. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who might need a little hope, a little warmth in their everyday life. We'll continue bringing you real, emotional, and deeply human stories like this every day just for you. Thank you for staying with us until the end of today's journey. We wish you and your loved ones good health, peaceful hearts, and joy in every moment. Until next time, take care, and see you in the next video.